Hello and welcome to Sunday School with First Baptist of Greensboro. I'm Reverend Courtney Willis, and I'm glad that you're here to join me as we study the scriptures together. Today we are going to be in Matthew chapter 18. If you want to grab your Bible so that you can read along with me, that would be great, but otherwise you can simply listen. As always, I'm working from the formations literature that we have here at church. You're welcome to pick up a copy if you would like that, but you don't have to in order to participate in this class. I would encourage you when I ask questions to take a moment and reflect on the answers, maybe write them down, maybe share them with someone close to you if you have others watching with you. But either way, take a moment and really reflect on what God is inviting you to consider. As we begin today, I do have a question for you, a couple actually, for you to think about. I wonder, whom is it easy for you to listen to in your life? And these can be big picture people that you would listen to that you may not even know, or it could be people who are very close to you that you find it easy to listen to. And then who do you struggle to listen to? Whose advice or whose words do you have a hard time listening to? Take a moment and think about who those people might be and share your answer. As I mentioned, we will be in Matthew chapter 18 today, and Jesus's teachings in this chapter are not written for individual Christians, but rather they're written to help Christian communities to live and work and even disagree together. So how do we repair broken relationships in our lives, in our communities, in our church? How do we restore a sense of community after we've had a disagreement? Churches need this kind of wisdom, and Jesus offers it to us in Matthew 18. In this week's passage, Jesus explains what it means for us to live not just as those who are forgiven, but as those who actively forgive others in the context of a loving and forgiving community. Living together in community can be really difficult. I'm sure we could all name examples of times when it's been hard for us to live with others. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus urges his followers to practice humility and forgiveness. They must think about the one rather than the 99. If offenses occur, they're invited to handle them with decorum and with sensitivity. If they must err, Jesus seems to say, then let them err on the side of unbounded forgiveness. Jesus's words address the themes of care, restoration, and hurt in the context of community. So let's take a look at Matthew chapter 18. We're going to read verses 10 through 22. And see what Jesus has to say about how we live with one another. So again, Matthew chapter 18, verses 10 through 22. And they say this: "Take care that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I tell you, in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. What do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep, and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one that went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. So it's not the will of your Father in heaven that one of these little ones should be lost. If another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If the member listens to you, you've regained that one. But if you're not listened to, take one or two others along with you, so that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If the member refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly, I tell you, whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Again, truly, I tell you, if two of you agree on earth about anything you ask, it will be done for you by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, I am there among them. Then Peter came and said to him, Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus said to him, not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. In this second half of Matthew's gospel, Jesus shifts toward preparing his disciples for his coming death. How will his followers work together when he is no longer physically present to guide them? Jesus' 4th major speech is sometimes called the community discourse, and it addresses that question. Through parable and teaching and dialogue, Jesus helps his disciples recognize the unique shape that their community must take to embody God's reign in the world. They have to look different. The first half of Jesus' discourse is shaped by a reminder of God's care, and by extension, the community's care. It says in verse 10, for the little ones. Verse 10 describes God using angels to care for those who seem the most insignificant. If God makes the angels, who don't need to shield themselves from God's face as most do, if God makes those angels attentive to the littlest ones, how much more attentive should God's community be? God's desire that the weakest voices in the community never be drowned or overlooked is a large part of what God is trying to teach humanity through the life of Jesus. Jesus illustrates this point with the parable of the shepherd and the lost sheep. Perhaps that was familiar to you. We find it in verses 12 through 14. Its initial rhetorical question in verse 12, what do you think? I love that. Assumes that the shepherd's actions are correct. What do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep, does he not leave the 99? But to Jesus's hearers, leaving 99 valuable sheep untended while searching for one lost sheep would have sounded ridiculous. The wilderness of Judea is hilly and has many places that sheep could navigate, but humans could not, which would make finding a sheep difficult. The myriad predators would have rendered the sheep vulnerable. The shepherd looks for the sheep with ostensibly little hope of finding it, and certainly of finding it alive. Yet, the shepherd never loses hope and puts everything on the line. The shepherd risks the whole flock for the sake of the one. And he does this not grudgingly, but with anticipation of joy. We see that in verse 13. If he finds it, truly, I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. Sorry, I lost my spot. Each sheep is of that much value to the shepherd. Each is essential to the health of the entire flock. Jesus' point is that every effort must be made to restore the community's wholeness when a member goes astray. Consider the lost sheep, the shepherd, the 99. With which of these characters do you identify with the most today? When you think of those, the sheep, the shepherd, the 99, who do you identify with? Take a moment and think about that. At first glance, Jesus' teachings that come next in verses 15 through 20 seem to contradict the parable that he just told about the sheep. In these verses, Jesus provides a way to address inevitable conflict in the community. When he says in verse 15, if another member of the church sins against you, go and point out the fault when you're alone. If that member listens to you, you have regained one. He urges this one-on-one conversation. The one harmed should take the initiative rather than waiting for the offender to come to him. Do this privately, Jesus says, in a spirit of loving the person rather than seeking to embarrass them. Yet also, do it without delay. Go ahead and do it so that any grievances can be brought out in the open and they're not harbored and they don't cause ill will. If the offender won't listen, it goes on in verse 16 to say the offended party is to try again, and this time bring one or two impartial witnesses along. Such a process for community reconciliation was known as early as the time of Moses. This was not new information. If this doesn't lead to restoration, the wider community should work together to repair this relational rift. And finally, Jesus says in verse 17, if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile or a tax collector. Many have interpreted this instruction as granting the church permission to excommunicate members. But remember, Matthew's gospel is named after none other than a tax collector who was included by Jesus in his community. Furthermore, Jesus never sent Gentiles away. That's not what he's telling them to do. Jesus healed them. He talked with them. He fed them. So it seems like Jesus's words are meant to be a little bit ironic. He's telling the disciples that even when you've done all you can do to come to an understanding with a person whose behavior is genuinely difficult, even if you had to keep distance from such a person, you are never finished reaching out to that person in grace and love. This approach seems to be more in tune with that preceding parable than assuming you should kick someone out. It also seems more difficult. Yet Jesus ends by reminding his disciples they are not doing this on their own power. Wherever 2 or 3 seek unity in his name, he will be there with them. He will empower them to seek what is holy and good. And so these words leave Peter with a question. What should we do if there is a reconciliation, but then that person does the same thing again and again? And Peter says, how many times should we go through this process of trying to restore the community? Is 7 a fair number? Some rabbis in the time of Jesus suggested 3 as a reasonable number of times to forgive. Peter no doubt thought by saying 7 that he was being generous, suggesting more than double of what would have been required otherwise. If you were Peter, how many times might you offer to forgive? Would your number be higher or lower than 7? When have you been in a situation that required repeat forgiveness? What do you think? Take a moment to think on that. Would you err less than 7, more than 7? What's your natural propensity toward forgiveness? And when have you had to examine that? Take a moment to reflect on that. Forgiveness, of course, is not about numbers. It's not about keeping track. It's not about limits. Jesus suggests in verse 22, not 7 times but I tell you, 77 times. This response calls to mind Genesis chapter 4, when Adam and Eve's son Cain murdered his brother Abel, and he was driven from the land. When Cain expressed fear that he would be vulnerable to vengeful attacks from others, God declared anyone who harmed him would suffer 7 times over what they inflicted. Several generations later, Cain's descendant Lamech boasted, "I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, truly I will be 77-fold." Jesus' choice of this number, 77, may imply that forgiveness is not just about individual situations, but it might be about reversing the endless cycle of vengeance that has dominated the history of God's people. Sadly, these verses have been misinterpreted to excuse destructive behavior, demanding that people in abusive relationships keep forgiving and returning to their abusers. And this, my friends, is the opposite of what Jesus intended. Jesus wants the entire cycle of violence that leads to all abuse finally put to an end. Forgiveness is about protecting the little ones, not furthering neglect or injury. This is the community that Jesus envisions continuing his work of grace and mercy and embrace. And today's story invites self-examination. Who are the little ones that we are quick to exclude or to neglect? How is forgiveness a hallmark of our own lives? How do we deal with conflict and hurt? Do you tend to ostracize or ignore? Or do you do the hard work of healing? It's not a given for all of us. A lot of us aren't taught well how to heal, how to forgive, how to go through conflict. The Greek word for forgive literally means to let go or to release. Forgiveness means letting go of the hurts that we are holding on to, not letting them dominate our hearts and our minds. So this week, I want to invite you to think about a particular anger or hurt that you are struggling to let go of. What would it look like for you to forgive, for you to release this situation? I hope you'll think about that this week. Will you pray with me? God, we are grateful for the life of Jesus Christ and the lessons that we are offered in your scriptures. Help us, Lord, to reconcile to one another, to go through conflict in the ways that you have invited us to, with honesty, with vulnerability, and with truth. Help us, oh God, to forgive through letting go, through releasing those who have harmed us into your care. And help us, God, to forgive ourselves. Amen. Next week, we're going to still be in Matthew. We're going to go over to Matthew chapter 25 to the last several verses. We're going to be in Matthew 25, verses 31 through 46. So I hope that you will go ahead and read part of Matthew 25 if you care to, or simply wait and read it along with me. Either way, I hope to see you again next week.